Because even when we believe nothing is happening, the body is already in conversation with every thought we think and every feeling we allow to stay. I've spent years observing this quiet dialogue, and what fascinates me most is how subtle it is. There's no alarm bell when a belief begins to shape biology, no clear signal when an emotion starts to alter chemistry. And yet, beneath our awareness, something extraordinary is unfolding. We often assume that the body reacts only to physical events, what we eat, how we move, the environment around us. But what I've come to understand is that the body is equally responsive to the invisible, to meaning, to interpretation, to the stories we repeat internally without even noticing. Think about a moment when you felt sudden fear. Maybe nothing physically dangerous was present, and yet your heart began to race, your muscles tightened, your breath shortened. The body didn't wait for confirmation. It responded instantly, not to reality, but to perception. And this is where the deeper insight begins to reveal itself. The body does not distinguish between what is real and what is vividly imagined. It responds to signals, not facts. And those signals are shaped by belief. When we hold a belief long enough, especially one charged with emotion, it becomes more than a thought. It becomes a pattern, and patterns, when repeated, become instructions. I've seen how this plays out in everyday life. A person who quietly believes they are not safe in the world may live in a constant state of low-level tension. They may not even be aware of the belief itself, but their body knows, their nervous system knows, it adapts to that expectation. Over time, this adaptation becomes their baseline. Now, here's where it becomes even more interesting. The body is not just reacting, it's learning. Every emotional experience leaves an imprint, not just in memory, but in physiology. The hormones released, the neural pathways activated, the muscular responses, all of it becomes part of a feedback loop. And the more often we revisit a certain emotional state, the more efficient the body becomes at reproducing it. In a sense, the body becomes conditioned to feel what the mind has practiced. So if we repeatedly experience stress, even in small doses, the body becomes very good at being stressed. It refines the process, it strengthens the pathways, it prepares itself to respond faster the next time. And eventually, it doesn't even need a strong trigger. A small thought, a subtle reminder, a familiar tone of voice, and the body is already moving into a state it has learned well. This is why so many people feel stuck in patterns they can't explain. They say, I don't know why I feel this way, or nothing is wrong, but I feel anxious. And what they're experiencing is not random, it's the body continuing a conversation that began long ago. A conversation shaped by beliefs, reinforced by emotions, and stored as a kind of biological memory. Now let me take you a step deeper. There's a moment, very subtle, almost invisible, where a thought becomes a feeling. And then that feeling begins to influence the body. If we catch that moment, we have a choice. But if we miss it, the process continues automatically. Most of us miss it, not because we're unaware, but because we've never been taught to look there. We've been trained to focus on outcomes, on what happens externally, but the real shift begins internally, at the level where perception is formed. And here's something I've noticed repeatedly. When we change the meaning we assign to an experience, the body responds differently. The same situation that once triggered stress can, under a different interpretation, produce calm. Not because the situation changed, but because the signal sent to the body changed. This tells us something profound. The body is not locked into one response. It is flexible, adaptive, responsive to new information, but it requires consistency. A single positive thought is not enough to override a deeply ingrained pattern. The body trusts repetition, it trusts familiarity. So if we want to create a new response, we must introduce a new pattern again and again until it becomes recognizable, until the body says, I know this feeling. And this is where emotion becomes incredibly important. Not surface level emotion, but genuine embodied feeling. The kind that you don't just think about, you experience, because it's the emotional intensity that signals the body to pay attention. It's what tells the system, this matters, remember this. So when we begin to consciously generate emotions like calm, gratitude, or confidence, not as ideas but as felt experiences, We are essentially teaching the body a new language. At first, it may feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. That's because the body is used to something else. But with repetition, something shifts. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The new pattern begins to stabilize, and gradually the body starts to respond differently, not just in those intentional moments, but in everyday life. This is where the transformation becomes visible. Reactions soften. Recovery becomes faster. The baseline begins to change. And what once felt automatic is no longer inevitable. But there's one more layer to this that often goes unnoticed. The body is not just responding to current thoughts and emotions, it is also anticipating future ones. Based on past patterns, it predicts what's coming next. If we've spent years expecting stress, the body prepares for it before it even arrives. It adjusts chemistry, posture, attention, all in advance. So in many cases, we are not reacting to the present moment. We are reacting to a prediction, and that prediction is based on belief. This is why awareness is so powerful, because the moment we become aware of a pattern, we interrupt it. Not completely, not instantly, but enough to create space. And in that space, something new becomes possible. A different response, a different feeling, a different outcome, but it requires presence. It requires the willingness to observe without immediately reacting, to notice the thought before it becomes the feeling, to sense the feeling before it becomes the reaction. And in that quiet space between stimulus and response, we begin to realize something that changes everything, that the body has been listening all along, waiting for a new signal, ready to respond the moment we choose to offer it something different. And this is where our responsibility becomes clear. Because once we recognize that the body is always listening, always adapting, we can no longer assume that our inner world is neutral. Every thought we rehearse, every emotion we sustain becomes part of the instructions we give to our biology. I've come to see this not as pressure, but as possibility. It means that even in moments when nothing outwardly changes, something inwardly can begin to reorganize quietly, gradually, without force. Let me show you how this unfolds in a practical sense. Imagine you wake up in the morning and almost automatically your mind begins to run familiar narratives. Thoughts about stress, about what could go wrong, about unresolved problems. You may not even question them. They feel normal, expected. But what's happening beneath that stream of thought is far more significant. The body is already adjusting. Stress hormones begin to rise. Muscles subtly contract. Breathing becomes shallow, not because anything has happened, but because something has been signaled. And if this pattern repeats day after day, the body begins to assume this is how life feels. This becomes the emotional set point. Now here's where the shift begins. If, in that same moment, we interrupt the pattern, not by force, but by awareness, we create a new opening. Instead of following the familiar thought, we observe it. We recognize it as a pattern, not a truth. That alone begins to change the signal. Because the moment we observe without engaging, we are no longer reinforcing the same pathway. We are stepping outside of it, even if just slightly. And then, intentionally, we introduce something new. Not a forced positive thought, but a genuine shift in attention. Maybe we focus on the breath, slowing it down, allowing it to deepen. Maybe we bring to mind a memory that evokes a sense of ease or appreciation. Something real, something we can feel. At first, the body may resist. It may not immediately align with this new direction because it's unfamiliar. It's been conditioned to respond differently. But if we stay with it, if we continue to feel rather than just think, the body begins to respond. The breath deepens naturally, the heart rate stabilizes, the muscles release. And in that moment, something important has happened. We have sent a new signal. Now, one moment like this may seem small, insignificant even, but the body doesn't measure change the way we do. It responds to consistency. So when we repeat this process, when we consciously shift from reaction to awareness, from habit to intention, we begin to build a new pattern. And over time, that pattern becomes stronger. What once required effort begins to feel natural. This is how the body learns a new way of being. But there's something even deeper happening beneath all of this. The relationship between thought and feeling is not one-directional. Yes, thoughts can create emotions, but emotions can also generate thoughts. And when an emotion becomes familiar, when the body has practiced it enough, it can begin to drive the thinking process. This is why sometimes we wake up feeling a certain way without any clear reason. The body is initiating the state, and the mind follows by creating thoughts that match it. It's a loop, a continuous exchange between mind and body, each reinforcing the other. So if we want to change the loop, we can begin from either side. We can shift the thought, or we can shift the feeling. But in my experience, the most powerful transformations happen when we engage both. When we become aware of the thoughts we're thinking and the emotions we're carrying, and we begin to consciously align them with a different intention. This doesn't mean denying difficult emotions or pretending everything is fine. It means acknowledging what is present without letting it define the next moment, because every moment carries the potential for a different response. And the body is always ready to follow. Let me give you another layer to consider. The body is deeply influenced by anticipation. When we expect something, whether positive or negative, the body begins to prepare as if it is already happening. This is not imagination in a passive sense. It is preparation in a biological sense. If we expect stress, the body organizes around that expectation. If we expect ease, it begins to move in that direction. So the question becomes, what are we consistently expecting? Not just consciously, but beneath the surface. What patterns have we rehearsed so often that they've become automatic predictions? Because those predictions are shaping our physiology long before any external event confirms them. And this is where conscious awareness becomes a kind of turning point. When we start to notice not just what we think, but what we expect, not just what we feel, but what we are preparing for, we begin to see the deeper structure of our experience. We begin to understand that much of what we feel is not a reaction, but a rehearsal. And once we see that, we gain access to something powerful. Choice, not in a superficial sense, but at a foundational level, the choice to pause before the pattern completes itself. The choice to feel something different, even if it's subtle. The choice to send a new signal, even if the old one is still present. And this is where patience becomes essential, because the body does not change instantly. It changes through repetition, through consistency, through lived experience. So we don't measure progress by dramatic shifts. We measure it by small changes. A quicker recovery from stress, a moment of awareness where there used to be automatic reaction, a sense of space where there used to be tension. These are the signs that something is changing, that the body is beginning to trust a new pattern. And as this continues, something remarkable begins to happen. The body no longer defaults to the old response. It begins to anticipate the new one. Calm becomes more accessible. Clarity becomes more consistent, and what once felt like effort becomes a natural state. But even here, the process is not complete, because the deeper we go, the more we begin to notice subtle layers of conditioning, patterns that were invisible before, responses that were too quick to catch. And this is where the journey becomes less about fixing and more about refining, less about changing who we are, and more about becoming aware of what has been running beneath the surface all along. And as that awareness deepens, we start to recognize that the body has never been working against us. It has always been responding, adapting, doing exactly what it was designed to do. The question was never whether the body was listening. The question was always, what signal have we been giving it, moment after moment, without realizing that every quiet thought, every unspoken expectation, every repeated emotional state was slowly becoming a blueprint that the body would follow without question, without hesitation, and without ever asking whether that pattern was truly serving us or simply repeating something we never consciously chose to continue. And when I began to truly see that, something shifted in the way I understood responsibility. Not responsibility as burden, but as awareness. Because if the body is faithfully carrying out the instructions it receives, then the quality of those instructions matters more than we've ever been taught to consider. I started to notice how often we live in inherited patterns, ways of thinking and feeling that we didn't consciously choose but gradually accepted, subtle beliefs about limitation, about struggle, about what is possible or not possible. These beliefs don't announce themselves. They operate quietly, shaping perception, guiding attention, influencing how we interpret every situation we encounter. And the body, as always, responds. It responds to the emotional tone of those beliefs. It adjusts chemistry based on expectation. It prepares for outcomes that haven't yet happened simply because they feel familiar. So what we experience as normal is often just repetition. But here's the deeper insight. What is familiar is not always what is true. And what is habitual is not always what is necessary. This realization opens a door, because if our internal patterns have been learned, then they can also be relearned. Not erased instantly, but gradually replaced. Not through force, but through consistency. I've found that one of the most powerful ways to begin this process is through attention. Where we place our attention determines what signals are amplified. If we consistently focus on what is lacking, the body aligns with that sense of lack. If we focus on what feels threatening, even subtly, the body prepares for defense. But when we begin to place attention on states that support balance, on steadiness, on openness, on possibility, the body starts to reorganize around those signals. And this doesn't require denial of reality. It requires a different relationship with it. Instead of reacting immediately, we observe. Instead of assuming, we inquire. Instead of repeating, we choose. Now, this choice is not always easy, because the body often prefers what it knows, even if what it knows is uncomfortable. Familiar discomfort can feel safer than unfamiliar ease. So when we begin to introduce new patterns, there can be resistance, a subtle pull back toward the old way. Thoughts that question the shift, feelings that don't immediately align. And this is where persistence becomes essential. Not forceful persistence, but gentle consistency. Returning again and again to the signal we want to strengthen, allowing the body time to adjust. Because every time we choose differently, even in a small way, we are interrupting the automatic cycle. We are creating space for something new to take root. Let me bring this into a very real, everyday example. Imagine you're in a conversation that begins to feel tense. Maybe the other person's tone shifts. Maybe something they say triggers a familiar reaction. In the past, the body might have immediately moved into defense, tightening, preparing, reacting. But now, with awareness, there's a pause, a brief moment where you notice the reaction beginning. You feel it in the body, the quickening, the contraction, but you don't immediately follow it. Instead, you breathe. You stay present. You allow the sensation without letting it dictate the response. And in that moment, something extraordinary happens. The pattern is interrupted. The body, expecting the usual reaction, receives a different signal. Not suppression, but presence. Not resistance, but awareness. And gradually, through experiences like this, the body begins to learn that it doesn't have to respond the same way every time. That it has options. That it can remain steady even when conditions are uncertain. This is not about controlling the body. It's about collaborating with it, understanding its language, working with its natural intelligence rather than against it, because the body is not separate from the mind. It is an extension of it, a living reflection of our inner world. And when we begin to align our thoughts, our emotions, and our awareness, the body responds with remarkable adaptability. But there is one more layer that often goes unnoticed. The environment we create internally influences how we perceive the environment externally. When the body is in a state of tension, the world can appear more threatening. When the body is at ease, the same world can feel more manageable, even supportive. So in many ways, we are not just reacting to the world, we are interacting with it through the lens of our internal state. And that lens is constantly being shaped by the signals we repeat. This is why two people can experience the same situation and respond in completely different ways. Their bodies are operating from different patterns, different expectations, different internal histories. So the work we do internally is not isolated. It affects how we show up in every interaction, every decision, every moment of perception. And as this awareness deepens, something begins to change in how we relate to ourselves. We become less reactive, more observant, less identified with every thought or feeling, more curious about them. We begin to see patterns not as fixed traits, but as processes that can evolve. And this shift in perspective creates a kind of freedom, not freedom from experience, but freedom within it. The ability to move through life without being completely defined by past conditioning. The ability to respond rather than react, to choose rather than repeat. And as we continue this process, something even more subtle begins to emerge. A sense of coherence, a feeling that the mind and body are no longer operating in conflict, but in alignment. Thoughts become clearer. Emotions become more balanced. The body feels more stable, more responsive rather than reactive. And from this state, new possibilities begin to appear. Not because the external world has changed, but because our way of engaging with it has transformed. But even here, the journey continues. Because awareness is not a final destination. It is an ongoing process, a continuous unfolding of deeper layers, subtler patterns, more refined choices. And as we move forward, we begin to notice that even the smallest signals we send, those quiet thoughts, those fleeting feelings, carry more influence than we once believed. That the body is always listening, always adapting, always ready to follow the direction we reinforce most consistently. And the question that begins to quietly form, almost beneath the surface of thought, is no longer about whether change is possible, but about how many of the responses we experience each day are truly conscious, and how many are simply echoes of patterns that have been repeating for so long that they feel like identity, when in reality they may just be signals we've practiced so often that the body no longer waits for permission before it begins to respond before we even realize a response has begun. And this is where the illusion of control starts to dissolve, because many of the reactions we take credit for are already in motion before conscious thought catches up. The body initiates and then the mind explains. We tell ourselves a story about why we feel the way we do, but the feeling often came first. I've watched this carefully, both in myself and in others. A subtle shift in posture, a tightening in the chest, a change in breathing, and only after that does the narrative appear. A thought forms to justify the sensation, to make sense of it, to give it a reason. But what if the reason is not the origin? What if the thought is simply catching up to something the body has already decided based on past conditioning? This changes how we approach awareness. Because instead of trying to control every thought, we begin by sensing the body. We notice the signals as they arise, before they fully develop into emotion, before they solidify into reaction. And in doing so, we access a deeper level of choice. Let me slow this down, because this is where the real work begins. There's a moment, very brief, often overlooked, where the body shifts from neutral into a patterned response. It might be triggered by something external, or it might arise internally, without any obvious cause. But if we're attentive, we can feel it. A contraction, a subtle pressure, a change in rhythm. This is the body beginning to follow a familiar script. And if we can stay present in that moment, without immediately reacting, without immediately interpreting, we create a gap. In that gap, the automatic sequence loses momentum. Not completely, but enough. Enough for us to introduce a different signal. Now, this doesn't mean suppressing what we feel. Suppression creates its own patterns, its own tension. What we're doing here is different. We're allowing the sensation, but not feeding it. We're observing without reinforcing. And that distinction is critical, because the body is highly responsive to reinforcement. What we repeatedly think and feel becomes stronger. What we observe without attachment begins to soften. So in that moment of awareness, we're not fighting the pattern. We're simply not continuing it. And that alone begins to change the trajectory. Over time, this practice builds sensitivity. We start to notice signals earlier. We catch patterns sooner. What once felt overwhelming becomes more manageable. Not because the intensity disappears, but because our relationship to it changes. And this shift in relationship is what transforms experience. Now, there's another layer that often reveals itself as we go deeper. The body not only remembers emotional patterns, it also remembers the identity associated with those patterns. In other words, certain feelings are tied to how we see ourselves. If someone has spent years identifying as anxious, the body has learned to support that identity. It knows how to produce those sensations. It knows how to maintain that state. So when we begin to change the pattern, it can feel unfamiliar, not just physically, but psychologically. We may even question it. This doesn't feel like me. And that's an important moment because it shows us how closely identity and biology are connected. The body is not just responding to thoughts and emotions. It is participating in a sense of self. So when we introduce new patterns, new ways of thinking, new ways of feeling, we are also reshaping identity. And that process takes time. It requires repetition, consistency, and a willingness to remain with the unfamiliar long enough for it to become natural. I've found that one of the most effective ways to support this shift is through intentional states, not forced emotions, but deliberately cultivated ones. States like calm presence, steady focus, quiet confidence. When we take time to feel these states, truly feel them in the body, we begin to create new reference points. The body starts to recognize these states as valid, as accessible. And with enough repetition, it begins to prefer them. Now, preference is powerful because once the body prefers a state, it starts to move toward it more easily. It becomes less effortful, more automatic. And this is where change becomes sustainable. Not because we're constantly managing ourselves, but because the underlying pattern has shifted. But we have to be honest about something here. This is not a quick process. The patterns we carry have often been reinforced over years, sometimes decades. They are deeply ingrained. So expecting instant change only creates frustration. Instead, we approach this with patience, with curiosity, with a willingness to notice even the smallest shifts. Because those small shifts are indicators. They show us that the process is working, that the body is beginning to respond differently. And as this continues, something subtle but profound begins to happen. We become less identified with every sensation. We feel emotions, but we are not defined by them. We experience thoughts, but we are not controlled by them. There's a space that opens between what we experience and how we respond. And in that space, we find a kind of stability, a grounded awareness that remains even as experiences change. This doesn't mean we stop feeling. It means we feel without being overwhelmed. We respond without being reactive. We engage without losing balance. And from this place, the body begins to operate differently. It becomes less reactive to minor triggers, more resilient under pressure, more adaptable in changing conditions, because it is no longer locked into a single pattern. It has learned flexibility, and flexibility is a sign of health, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. Now, as we continue to explore this, another question naturally arises. If the body is so responsive to internal signals, if it is constantly adapting to thought, emotion, and belief, then what happens when we begin to consciously align those signals over time? Not just in isolated moments, but consistently, day after day, moment after moment. What kind of state does the body begin to stabilize into? What becomes our new baseline? And more importantly, what possibilities begin to open when the body is no longer reacting to old patterns, but instead responding to a new level of awareness that is still forming, still evolving, and just beginning to show us what it means to live without being unconsciously driven by signals we never realized we were sending in the first place. Beginning to stabilize into something we may not have experienced before. And when that stabilization starts to happen, even in subtle ways, the difference is unmistakable. It's not dramatic at first. It doesn't announce itself with intensity. Instead, it shows up as a quiet shift in how we move through ordinary moments. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions now feel slightly different. slower, more spacious. There's a fraction of a second more awareness, and in that fraction, everything begins to change. I've noticed that when the body starts to align with new signals, it no longer rushes to complete the old patterns. It hesitates not out of confusion, but because it's learning a different rhythm. And that hesitation is powerful because it gives us access to something we rarely had before, choice that feels real, not forced. We're no longer trying to override a reaction after it has already taken hold. We're meeting it at the point where it begins, where it's still flexible, still open to influence. This is where transformation becomes practical. Not as an idea, not as a concept, but as something we can feel in real time. Let me take you deeper into what this looks like. There was a time when certain thoughts would immediately pull me into a familiar emotional state. A memory, a worry, a projection about the future, and the body would follow without hesitation. But as awareness grew, something shifted. The same thought might appear, but it didn't carry the same weight. It was as if the connection between thought and emotion had loosened. The body no longer responded automatically, and in that space, I realized something important. Thoughts by themselves are not as powerful as we assume. It's the emotional charge we attach to them, the repetition, the identification that gives them influence over the body. So when we begin to observe thoughts without immediately believing them, without feeding them with emotion, they lose their ability to dictate our state. And the body, sensing this change, begins to respond differently. It doesn't activate the same chemistry. It doesn't prepare for the same outcome. It waits. And in that waiting, we have an opportunity to introduce a new direction. Now, this doesn't mean that challenging thoughts disappear. They still arise, but our relationship with them changes. We see them as patterns, not commands, as possibilities, not certainties. And this shift alone reduces their impact on the body. But there's another layer that becomes visible as we continue. The body starts to trust the new signals. At first, it may have been uncertain, even resistant. But with repetition, consistency, and genuine feeling, it begins to recognize these signals as reliable. And trust changes everything. Because once the body trusts a new pattern, it doesn't need to be convinced each time. It responds more quickly, more naturally. It begins to anticipate the new state, just as it once anticipated the old one. And this is where we start to experience a different kind of baseline. A baseline that is not built on tension or reactivity, but on steadiness, on presence, on a sense of internal balance that doesn't depend entirely on external conditions. Now, this doesn't mean life becomes predictable or easy. Challenges still arise. Uncertainty still exists. But the way we meet those experiences is different. The body is no longer preparing for stress as the default. It has other options. And because of that, our responses become more intentional, more aligned with what we actually want, rather than what we've habitually repeated. Let me share another observation that often surprises people. As the body shifts into a more balanced state, perception itself begins to change. We start to notice things we previously overlooked. Moments of ease, subtle opportunities, signals of support in our environment. Not because they weren't there before, but because our internal state wasn't tuned to recognize them. The body influences attention, and attention shapes experience. So when the body is no longer locked into patterns of tension or anticipation of difficulty, it frees up resources. It allows us to see more clearly, to respond more creatively, to engage more fully with what is actually happening rather than what we expect to happen. And this brings us to a deeper understanding. We are not just changing how we feel, we are changing how we perceive reality. Not in a dramatic or abstract sense, but in the way we interpret, respond, and interact with each moment. And that has far-reaching effects, because every decision we make is influenced by how we perceive the situation in front of us. Every interaction is shaped by the state we bring into it. So as the body stabilizes into a new pattern, our choices begin to reflect that stability. We become less reactive, more deliberate, less driven by past conditioning, more guided by present awareness. And over time, this creates a kind of coherence in our lives. Our thoughts, emotions, and actions begin to align. There's less internal conflict, less contradiction, more clarity. And from that clarity, something new begins to emerge. A sense of direction that is not forced but felt. A way of moving through life that is responsive rather than reactive. And yet, even as this unfolds, there's still more to notice. Because the deeper we go, the more refined our awareness becomes. We begin to detect subtler patterns, micro-reactions, fleeting expectations, almost invisible shifts in state. And this is where the work becomes more nuanced. Less about changing obvious reactions, and more about refining the signals at their origin, at the level where thought, feeling, and attention first begin to organize experience. And as we continue to explore this level, we start to realize something that reshapes everything we've discussed so far. That the body is not just responding to individual thoughts or emotions, it is responding to the overall coherence or incoherence of our internal world. How aligned our thoughts are with our feelings. How consistent our attention is with our intentions. How stable our awareness remains across changing conditions. And when these elements begin to align, even imperfectly, the body responds in a way that is fundamentally different. It doesn't just react, it supports, it amplifies. It becomes an ally in the process of transformation. But if there is misalignment, if our thoughts say one thing, our emotions signal another, and our attention is scattered, the body reflects that as well. Through tension, through inconsistency, through a lack of stability that we may feel but not fully understand. So the question that naturally arises here is not just about what we think or feel in isolated moments, but about how coherent our internal signals are over time, and what the body begins to do when it finally receives a consistent message it can trust, one that is no longer fragmented or conflicting, but unified in a way that allows it to respond with a level of balance and intelligence that we may have never fully experienced before, quietly waiting beneath the surface for us to recognize that everything we've been searching for externally may have always been forming internally, one signal at a time, just beyond the threshold of our awareness, as it continues to organize itself into patterns that either support us or quietly hold us in place. And when I began to notice this level of organization, I realized something that changed how I approached every moment. The body is not waiting for perfection. It is responding to consistency. Even imperfect signals, if repeated often enough, become the foundation of a new pattern. And this removes the pressure to get it right every time. Instead, it invites us to return again and again to the direction we want to move in. Because direction matters more than intensity. A single powerful moment of awareness is meaningful, but it is the gentle, repeated shifts that reshape the body over time. I've seen how people search for breakthroughs, sudden, dramatic changes that transform everything at once. And while those moments can happen, they are not what sustain change. What sustains change is familiarity. The body learns through repetition. It trusts what it experiences consistently. So when we begin to introduce a new way of being, calm instead of tension, presence instead of distraction, openness instead of contraction, we are teaching the body something new one moment at a time. And at first it may feel subtle, almost too subtle to notice. But that's how all lasting patterns begin, quietly, without announcement. Let me bring your attention to something you may have experienced without fully recognizing it. There are moments, brief, almost fleeting, when everything feels aligned. The mind is clear, the body is at ease. There is no internal resistance, no urgency, no tension pulling in different directions. In those moments, we feel whole, not because everything in life is perfect, but because our internal state is coherent. And when that coherence is present, the body functions differently. Energy flows more efficiently. Attention becomes steady. Decisions feel less forced. It's as if the system is working with itself rather than against itself. Now imagine what happens when those moments are no longer occasional but become more frequent. When the body begins to recognize coherence as a familiar state. When it starts to organize around that stability rather than around stress or anticipation. This is where a deeper transformation begins, not just in how we feel, but in how we operate. Because when the body is no longer using its resources to manage constant tension, those resources become available for something else. Clarity, creativity, adaptability. And this changes the way we engage with the world. We're no longer reacting from a place of depletion. We're responding from a place of balance. Now, there's an important detail here that often goes unnoticed. Coherence is not something we force. It's something we allow. It emerges when we stop sending conflicting signals, when our thoughts are not pulling in one direction while our emotions move in another, when our attention is not scattered across past and future, but grounded in the present moment. And this brings us back to awareness, because awareness is what allows us to notice when we are out of alignment. It shows us when we are thinking one thing but feeling another, when we are saying we want change but internally reinforcing the same pattern. And without judgment, without resistance, we can gently bring those elements back into alignment. Not perfectly, but progressively. And the body responds to that effort. It recognizes the shift. It adjusts. It begins to trust that something new is being established. Now, as this process continues, another realization begins to take shape. The external world does not need to change for the internal state to shift. We often wait for circumstances to improve before we allow ourselves to feel better. We tell ourselves that once things are resolved, once conditions are right, then we can relax, then we can feel at ease. But the body doesn't operate on that timeline. It responds to what is happening internally right now. So when we begin to generate coherence from within, independent of external conditions, we create a stable foundation. And from that foundation, we engage with the world differently. We're less dependent on outcomes, less reactive to uncertainty, more capable of maintaining balance even when things are changing around us. And this is where a quiet kind of confidence begins to emerge. Not confidence based on control, but on trust. Trust in the body's ability to adapt. Trust in our capacity to respond. Trust in the process we are cultivating. Now, this doesn't mean we stop experiencing challenges. It means we meet them from a different state. A state that is not immediately overwhelmed. A state that has space. And in that space, we have options. We can pause. We can observe. We can choose. And each time we do, we reinforce the new pattern. Each time we remain present instead of reactive, we send a signal that strengthens coherence. Each time we align thought, feeling, and attention, even briefly, we teach the body what is possible. And over time, what is possible becomes what is familiar. What is familiar becomes what is natural. And what is natural becomes our new baseline. But even as this baseline shifts, the process doesn't end, because awareness continues to deepen. We begin to notice more subtle layers, patterns that once felt invisible, now becoming clearer. And with that clarity comes a new level of choice, not just in how we respond, but in how we relate to the entire process of experience. We start to see that the body has never been separate from our inner world. It has always been an expression of it, a reflection, a partner in every thought, every emotion, every belief we carry. And when we truly understand this, not just intellectually, but experientially, we begin to engage with ourselves differently, with more attention, more intention, more care, because we recognize that every signal matters, every moment contributes. Every subtle shift has the potential to shape what comes next. And as this understanding settles in, something begins to unfold naturally. A sense of alignment that is not forced, a stability that is not rigid, a responsiveness that is not driven by old patterns but guided by present awareness. And from this place, a deeper question begins to form, not about how to control the body or eliminate every unwanted response, but about how far this alignment can go, how deeply the body can adapt when it is consistently given clear and coherent signals. And what begins to emerge when the patterns we have practiced for so long are gradually replaced by something we are only just beginning to explore, something that feels both unfamiliar and deeply natural at the same time, as if the body has been waiting for this level of awareness all along, quietly responding to every signal we've ever given it, and now for the first time receiving something different, something intentional, something that may lead us into a way of being that we have not yet fully imagined, but can already begin to sense just beneath the surface as it continues to
When we step back and look carefully at everything we've explored, a deeper pattern begins to reveal itself, one that is both simple and profound. The body is not reacting randomly, it is responding intelligently to signals we send, often without realizing we are sending them. Let me guide you through this in a way that feels clear and practical. Imagine your body as a highly responsive instrument, not a passive object, but something constantly tuning itself based on input. That input doesn't just come from food, movement, or environment, it comes from thought and emotion. Now, here's the key insight: the body does not wait for long explanations, it responds to repetition. If you think a stressful thought once, the body reacts briefly. But if you think it 10 times, 100 times every day, the body begins to memorize that state. It becomes familiar. Eventually, it becomes automatic. This is how patterns are formed. Think of it like walking through a field of grass. The first time you walk across it, there's no clear path. But if you walk the same route every day, a trail begins to appear. Over time, that trail becomes the easiest path to follow. Your body works in a similar way. Repeated thoughts and emotions create paths in your nervous system. And once those paths are established, the body naturally follows them, even when you don't consciously choose to. This is why many people feel stuck in certain emotional states. It's not because they want to feel that way. It's because the body has learned that pattern so well that it begins to run it automatically. Now let's go one layer deeper. There is a powerful connection between how you think, how you feel, and how your body responds biologically. When you experience an emotion like stress, calm, or joy, your body releases specific chemicals. Stress might release tension related hormones. Calm might shift your breathing and heart rhythm. Over time, the body becomes familiar with these chemical states. And here's something important to understand: the body can become used to certain emotional states, not in a conscious way, but in a biological way. So, if someone experiences stress frequently, the body adapts to that pattern. It becomes efficient at producing that state. It starts to expect it. This is why even small triggers can cause strong reactions. The body is not overreacting. It is following a well practiced pathway. Now, here's where your power begins. If patterns can be learned, they can also be changed. But change doesn't come from force. It comes from awareness and repetition in a new direction. Let's make this very practical. First, begin by noticing your state, not judging it, not trying to fix it immediately, just noticing. For example, during your day, pause and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now in my body? You might notice tension in your shoulders, tightness in your chest, or restlessness in your breath. This awareness alone is powerful. Why? Because you are interrupting the automatic pattern. You are bringing light to something that usually runs in the background. Second, once you notice the state, gently shift your attention to your breath. Slow it down, deepen it slightly. There is a strong connection between breath and the nervous system. When you slow your breathing, you send a signal to the body that it is safe to relax. You're not forcing calm, you're allowing the body to move in that direction. Third, introduce a feeling intentionally. This is where many people make a mistake. They try to think positive, but the body responds more to feeling than to words. So instead of just thinking, I am calm, try to feel what calm would be like, even if it's subtle. Maybe it's a sense of softness in your chest. Maybe it's a slight release in your shoulders. Maybe it's just one deeper breath. That's enough to begin. Remember, the body responds to consistency, not intensity. Fourth, repeat this process regularly, not just when things go wrong, but throughout your day. Small moments of awareness, breath, and intentional feeling begin to create a new pattern. At first, it may feel unfamiliar. That's natural. You are stepping off the old path and beginning to create a new one. With repetition, the new path becomes easier to follow. Now let's connect this to real life. Imagine you're in a difficult conversation. In the past, your body might immediately react, tightening, preparing, becoming defensive. But with awareness, you begin to notice that reaction as it starts. You feel the tension, but you don't immediately act on it. You take one slow breath. You soften your posture slightly, and in that small shift, your response changes. You listen more, you react less. The outcome of the conversation begins to change, not because the other person changed, but because your internal state changed. This is how powerful this work is. It doesn't require dramatic transformation overnight. It works through small, consistent shifts that gradually reshape your baseline. Over time, you may begin to notice you recover from stress more quickly. You feel less reactive in situations that used to trigger you. You experience more moments of calm without effort. These are signs that your body is learning a new pattern. Now, there's a deeper meaning behind all of this. It shows us that we are not separate from our experiences. We are participating in them. Our inner state influences how we perceive the world, how we respond to it, and ultimately what we experience. This is not about controlling everything. It's about becoming aware of the signals we are sending and choosing them more consciously. Because whether we realize it or not, the body is always listening, always adapting, always responding. So the question is not whether your body is responding. The question is, what is it responding to? And once you begin to see that clearly, even in small moments, you start to realize something powerful. That change doesn't begin out there in the world. It begins in the quiet, often unnoticed signals you send within, moment by moment, as your body patiently follows the direction you reinforce most consistently, shaping not only how you feel, but how you live,